Imagine the most catastrophic war in ninja history, a conflict where dead legends were resurrected, where the moon itself became a weapon, where gods descended from another dimension to reshape reality. And then imagine that right in the middle of all of that, a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit showed up, looked around, yawned, and wondered if there was anything strong enough to make him feel something. That's not a joke. That's not a parody. That is the most terrifying scenario the Naruto universe never prepared for, because every single threat in that world was built around the assumption that power has limits, that even the strongest fighter bleeds, that even the most broken technique can eventually be countered. And Saitama breaks every single one of those assumptions without even trying. The fourth great ninja war threw everything at the shinobi world. It threw an army of 60,000 reanimated corpses. It threw the Ten Tails, a creature so massive it could swallow mountains. It threw Madara Uchiha, a man who literally caught meteors with his bare hands and laughed. It threw Kaguya Otsutsuki, an actual goddess who created the ninja world's chakra system from scratch. And none of it was enough to end the world only because Naruto, Sasuke, and their allies pushed beyond every human limit they had. But what if they didn't have to? What if, before any of that could spiral into catastrophe, a man who has already surpassed every limit just happened to walk onto that battlefield? If you've ever watched Naruto and thought Madara was untouchable, or felt your jaw drop when Kaguya first appeared, or wondered what it would actually look like if a character with zero narrative weakness entered a story built entirely around the drama of weakness, then this video is going to do something to your brain. We're not just asking who would win. We're asking what happens to an entire war, an entire world's worth of stakes, an entire cast of characters who have trained their whole lives, when someone shows up who didn't train at all, who just got strong, and who genuinely cannot find a reason to care. Stick around, because this is going to go places you did not expect. To understand why Saitama's presence in this war would be so completely and utterly world-altering, you first have to understand just how broken the fourth great ninja war already was before anyone even threw the first punch. Because this wasn't a war in the traditional sense of two armies meeting on a field with swords and strategy, and the hope that the side with better tactics walks away standing. This was something else entirely. This was a war where the rules of life and death had already been suspended before the opening bell, where the enemy wasn't just strong but literally unkillable in the conventional sense, and where the scale of destruction being threatened wasn't the fall of a village or even a country, but the complete psychological enslavement of every living human being on the planet. When Tobei, the man the world knew as Madara Uchiha at the time, announced the Eye of the Moon plan to the assembled Kage, he wasn't posturing. He wasn't bluffing in the way that villains bluff when they want to seem more dangerous than they are. He had a legitimate step-by-step strategy for capturing all 9-tailed beasts, resurrecting the 10 tails, becoming its Jinchuriki, and then casting the infinite Tsukuyomi over the entire world using the moon as a reflective surface, trapping every human consciousness in an eternal dream while their bodies were slowly absorbed into the God tree. That's what was on the table, not conquest, not dominance. The complete and permanent erasure of human free will and individual existence as a concept. And the army he built to make that happen wasn't assembled from living soldiers he'd recruited and trained, because living soldiers can defect, can doubt, can choose to lay down their weapons when the cause feels wrong. Instead, Tobei worked with Kabuto Yakushi, a man who had taken Orochimaru's already deeply disturbing experiments with reanimation and pushed them so far beyond their original limits that even Orochimaru himself admitted he couldn't replicate what Kabuto had achieved. The impure world reincarnation technique, Edo Tensei, was designed originally by the second Hokage as a forbidden jutsu for exactly the reasons you'd expect. It was an affront to the natural order, a way of pulling souls back from the afterlife and trapping them inside regenerating corpses, forcing them to fight against their own will. Kabuto didn't just use this technique, he perfected it. He removed the one critical weakness that had always made Edo Tensei theoretically stoppable, which was the fact that the caster could be forced to release the technique if the summoning scroll was destroyed or if the caster was neutralized. Kabuto's version ran on its own momentum. The reanimated shinobi couldn't be freed through conventional means. They would regenerate from any damage, no matter how severe, which meant that even the most powerful living ninja in the war couldn't permanently stop an Edo Tensei shinobi. They could only suppress them, seal them, or find a way to convince Kabuto himself to end the technique. Every single one of those options required enormous cost in time, chakra, and lives. The reanimated soldiers Kabuto deployed weren't nameless filler warriors either, and this is the part that made the whole thing so psychologically devastating for the Shinobi Alliance. These were legends. These were people who had shaped the history of the ninja world, whose names were spoken with reverence in every village, whose techniques had become the foundation of entire fighting styles. The 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, the previous Kage of multiple villages. Asuma Sarutobi, who had been a father figure to an entire generation of Leaf Ninja, and whose death had already broken Team 10 once. Itachi Uchiha, possibly the most gifted shinobi of his generation, brought back and deployed against the very village he had sacrificed everything to protect. Nagato, whose Rinnegan gave him access to the 6 paths of pain techniques, making him effectively a one-man army capable of leveling entire villages on his own. And then, sitting at what felt like the absolute ceiling of what Edo Tensei could summon, were the 2 names that made every experienced ninja on the Alliance side go quiet when they heard them spoken together. Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha, the 2 men whose rivalry had literally defined the entire history of the shinobi world, both of them reanimated, both of them available to be deployed on the battlefield at the same time. Hashirama Senju was the first Hokage, and his power level is one of those things that the Naruto series keeps returning to as a kind of baseline for what impossibly strong means in that world. Because every time a character is described as approaching Hashirama's level, the implication is that they've reached something close to the ceiling. His wood release was a Kage Genkai so rare and so powerful that it was essentially unreproducible. Orochimaru spent years trying to synthesize it through DNA experimentation and got only pale imitations. His chakra reserves were described by people who had actually fought him as feeling like standing next to a natural disaster, not a person. His ability to create enormous wooden constructs that could restrain and suppress tailed beasts was the original solution to the problem of Biju control, and it worked because Hashirama's chakra had a soothing, almost divine quality to it that could calm even the most violent chakra monster. And yet, for all of that, Hashirama was not the most terrifying name on Kabuto's reanimation roster. Madara Uchiha was. Madara's reputation in the Naruto world functions almost like a myth that turned out to be true, and the reason his presence on the battlefield hit so hard wasn't just about raw power, though the raw power was genuinely staggering. It was about what Madara represented conceptually, which was the idea that a human being could, through a combination of natural genius, ruthless ambition, and a willingness to cross every ethical and physical line in existence, elevate themselves so far beyond the normal ceiling of human capability that the word human started to feel like a loose approximation. Madara had awakened the Mangekaiwu Sharingan in both eyes, and then pushed further to awaken the eternal Mangekaiwu by transplanting his brother's eyes, which gave him visual powers that most ninja would never even witness in their lifetimes. He had absorbed Hashirama's cells and awakened the Rinnegan, adding the entire suite of 6 paths abilities to a toolkit that was already overflowing. He could summon and manipulate the complete body Susanoo, an enormous spectral warrior so large it could trade blows with tailed beasts. He could use limbo, a technique that created shadow clones in a dimension invisible to nearly every known Dojutsu, meaning fighters were being hit by attacks they literally could not see or perceive. And at the point when he was fighting as an Edo Tensei reincarnation, he wasn't even at his actual peak. He was still holding back, still working within the constraints of a borrowed body, and he was still enough to casually defeat an entire division of Alliance shinobi while waiting for something more interesting to come along. This is the war that Saitama would be entering, not a war where the strongest fighter wins if they try hard enough. A war where the concept of trying hard enough had already been pushed past every known limit by multiple parties simultaneously, where the battlefield was operating at a scale of power that the previous generation of ninja would have considered impossible, where Naruto and Sasuke were on a desperate developmental race to reach a level that could actually contend with what was coming, and where every minute of fighting was costing the Alliance in lives and chakra that could not be recovered. The Alliance was 50,000 strong. It had the best strategists from every hidden village. It had tailed beast Jinchuriki. It had the Hokage herself, Tsunade, keeping people alive through medical ninjutsu that pushed the boundaries of what human healing could accomplish. And it was still losing, still bleeding, still watching the scale tip slowly but inevitably toward Tobai's endgame, because the fundamental problem wasn't strategy or courage or the willingness to sacrifice. It was that the enemy had been built specifically to be unanswerable, to exhaust every option until there were no options left. And into this, a man who never runs out of options because he only ever needed one. Before we can talk about what Saitama does to this war, we have to talk about who Saitama actually is. Not in the way that a power scaling video talks about him or you just list his feats and compare numbers, but in the deeper sense of what he represents as a character, what his existence means philosophically, and why dropping him into the fourth great ninja war isn't just a power fantasy about watching someone punch gods. It's genuinely one of the most interesting thought experiments you can run with these two properties together, because the contrast between what the Naruto world values and what Saitama is creates a kind of narrative friction that makes every single interaction worth thinking about carefully. The Naruto world is built, at its absolute foundation, on the idea that strength is earned. This isn't just a theme that the series explores occasionally. It is the load-bearing wall of the entire fictional universe. Every character's power level exists in direct relationship to their history of suffering, training, sacrifice, and growth. Naruto Uzumaki spent the first decade of his life being rejected, isolated, and treated as a monster by the village that was supposed to be his home, and his eventual power is narratively inseparable from that history of pain. The reason his Rasengan hits as hard as it does, metaphorically speaking, is because we know exactly what it cost him to learn it, what it meant to him to master it, what part of himself he poured into it. Rock Lee couldn't use ninjutsu or genjutsu, which in the ninja world is roughly equivalent to being told you have no future, and he responded by training his physical body to such an extreme that he could open the 8 inner gates and briefly move faster than the Sharingan could track. And when he did it for the first time against Gaara, it meant something enormous because we had watched him fail and cry and get back up and fail again. Even Sasuke's power, which often comes across as more naturally gifted than earned, is deeply tied to trauma. The Sharingan awakens through emotional extremity. The Mangekyou awakens through loss so severe it breaks something inside you, and every advancement in his eyes came at the cost of something he could never get back. Power in the Naruto world has a price, and that price is the point. The price is what makes the power meaningful. The price is what makes the audience invested in whether or not a character succeeds. Because if strength were free, if you could simply decide to be the strongest without paying anything for it, then the entire emotional architecture of the series collapses. You can't root for Naruto's perseverance if perseverance is just one option among many equal options. You can't feel the weight of Lee's sacrifice if sacrifice is optional. The system requires that power be hard, that it demands something real from the person who wants it, that the gap between where you are and where you need to be is crossed only through genuine and costly effort. Saitama paid the price. That's the first thing to understand, and it's the thing that gets glossed over most often in discussions about his character. He didn't wake up one morning having always been invincible. He was a normal person, unemployed, directionless, living in a tiny apartment in a world constantly threatened by monsters, and he decided, for no grand reason, with no destiny attached, with no prophecy pointing at him and no mentor guiding him, that he wanted to be a hero. So he trained. He trained for 3 years with a regimen so simple it sounds like a joke. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run every single day. No rest days, no exceptions. He ate 3 meals a day and never turned on the air conditioning in summer or the heat in winter. That was it. That was the whole program. And somewhere in the middle of that 3 years, something broke in him, physically, metaphysically, in whatever way the One-Punch Man universe tracks human limits, and he came out the other side completely bald and completely invincible. He surpassed the ceiling so completely that the ceiling ceased to exist for him. But here is the tragedy that the Naruto world would not understand about Saitama, and it is a real tragedy even though it's often played for comedy in his own series. He won too completely. He solved the problem of power so thoroughly that it cost him the one thing that makes power feel like it matters, which is the experience of struggle. Saitama cannot feel a fight anymore. He cannot feel the tension of not knowing whether he'll survive. He cannot feel his heart pounding with the desperate energy of pushing past his limits because he has no limits to push past. Every monster that faces him, no matter how many cities they've destroyed, no matter how many heroes they've defeated, no matter how insurmountably powerful they appear to be, they all end in one punch. The fights are over before they can become fights. The drama evaporates before it can form. And Saitama walks through his own story like a man who has been given every possible answer to every possible question, but was never allowed to enjoy asking the questions in the first place. This is what makes him genuinely one of the most complex protagonists in modern anime, because his arc isn't about getting stronger or discovering his true potential or finding the enemy worthy of his full power. It's about depression, about the hollow feeling that comes when you achieve a goal so completely that the goal no longer gives you anything. He trained to be a hero because he wanted to feel the excitement of battle, the thrill of pushing himself, the satisfaction of overcoming something truly difficult. And the tragedy is that, in achieving the ability to overcome anything, he lost the ability to feel the overcoming. He stands in the middle of fights that should be legendary and feels nothing, not because he's emotionally broken in a dramatic way, but because the gap between him and every opponent is so vast that his brain literally has nothing to process. It's like asking someone to feel nervous about a chess match when they already know every possible outcome of every possible move before their opponent even sits down. Now put that man on the battlefield of the Fourth Great Ninja War. Not because he was summoned, not because some technique pulled him across dimensions with dramatic purpose, but in the way that things happen in Saitama's life, accidentally, mundanely, with a complete lack of ceremony that makes the situation somehow more absurd and more perfect at the same time. Maybe he was chasing a monster that opened a dimensional rift. Maybe he jumped too hard and overshot his intended destination by several fictional universes. Maybe he was just walking and ended up somewhere that wasn't where he started, which, given what we know about Saitama's relationship with physics, is entirely plausible. The how doesn't need to be complicated, because the interesting part isn't the mechanism of arrival. The interesting part is the moment he lands, looks around at 50,000 Alliance ninja arrayed against an army of immortal reanimated legends, watches a meteor get punted across the sky somewhere in the middle distance, hears the ground shaking from the footsteps of something enormous approaching from the horizon, and his first thought, his genuine unfiltered first thought, is something approximately equivalent to, this seems like it might be interesting. That flicker of potential interest is significant because it's rare for Saitama. He doesn't get interested easily anymore. The scale of what's happening around him in the war is, by the standards of his own universe, actually considerable, not because individual fighters are stronger than what he's faced before, because they categorically aren't, but because the sheer volume and variety of the situation presents the theoretical possibility of something he's been chasing since he lost the ability to feel challenge. Maybe, somewhere in this impossibly crowded battlefield, there is something that will make him feel something. That hope, faint and habitual as it is by now, is enough to make him stay and look around. It's enough to make him curious about the large, angry men in the distance pulling meteors down from the sky. It's enough to make him take a few steps forward instead of immediately losing interest and wondering if there's a sale at the supermarket. The Alliance ninjas see him before he sees them in any meaningful way, and their reaction is entirely understandable given the context. They're in the middle of a war. An unknown person has appeared on the battlefield from an indeterminate direction, wearing a civilian jumpsuit in a yellow color that is frankly somewhat alarming in a combat environment, with no visible weapons, no chakra signature that any sensor-type ninja can identify. And this last detail is the first thing that starts to bend minds, because sensor-type ninja in the Naruto world can feel chakra at enormous distances and with remarkable precision. And the complete absence of a readable chakra signature doesn't mean someone is weak. It means either they're so perfectly suppressing their chakra that not a single trace leaks out, which requires mastery far beyond most people's capabilities, or their energy is operating on a wavelength so fundamentally different from chakra that the sensors don't have a framework for detecting it at all. Both options are alarming. Both options make experienced ninja reach for weapons and adopt defensive formations without needing to be told to. And Saitama walks right through those formations, not because he's trying to intimidate anyone or demonstrate power or send a message, but because he's looking at something in the distance that looks more interesting than the people pointing weapons at him, and he's the kind of person who will absolutely walk past 30 armed soldiers if there's something shiny happening further away. He is not disrespecting them. He is not calculating that they're beneath his notice. He is simply and genuinely more focused on whatever is happening on the horizon, and this complete absence of aggressive intent combined with the complete absence of any detectable reason why 30 armed ninja didn't just stop him is, for the Alliance soldiers who just watched it happen, one of the more quietly terrifying things they've witnessed on a day that has already contained several legitimately terrifying things. Someone is going to have to explain this to headquarters. Someone is going to have to send a messenger hawk to whatever commander is overseeing this sector and write the words, "Unknown civilian walked through combat formation. No chakra signature. Ignored all attempts at challenge. Appears to be heading toward the front lines. Uncertain what to do." And that message is going to travel up the chain of command and arrive on the desk of someone who has to decide what it means. And while all of that bureaucratic chaos is unfolding in the background, Saitama is already approaching the part of the battlefield where the air tastes like lightning and the ground doesn't stop shaking. And for the first time in longer than he can clearly remember, he has a feeling in his chest that might, if he's being optimistic, be something close to anticipation. The first real contact Saitama has with the war, not the peripheral edges of it where confused Alliance soldiers are trying to figure out what they just saw, but the actual war, the burning center of it where the ground is cracked open and the air is thick with the residue of techniques that would level entire districts if they landed in a populated area, happens in the sector where several reanimated Kage have been deployed. And the reason this particular entry point matters is because it establishes something important about how the Naruto world is going to process Saitama before the more dramatic confrontations happen later. The reanimated Kage aren't nobodies. They are the former leaders of hidden villages, people who reached the absolute peak of their respective nations' power structures, who were chosen above every other candidate specifically, because their strength and judgment were considered exceptional even by the standards of exceptional people. And they are currently in the process of dismantling an alliance division that has been fighting desperately and losing ground steadily despite fighting with everything they have. Because Edo Tensei shinobi don't tire, don't feel pain in any way that slows them down, and regenerate from damage fast enough that conventional offensive tactics are essentially a way of buying time rather than actually solving the problem. The Alliance ninja in this sector are not cowards and they are not weak. And this is worth saying explicitly because the scene that's about to unfold could be misread as a commentary on their inadequacy, which is completely the wrong interpretation. These are trained, experienced, genuinely capable fighters who are doing everything right within the framework of what they know how to do, and the framework simply isn't sufficient for the problem in front of them. They're using coordinated formations to concentrate damage. They're using sealing techniques to try to suppress and immobilize the reanimated bodies long enough to apply restraints. They're rotating fighters so that exhausted units can pull back and recover while fresh units absorb the pressure. All of this is tactically sound. All of this represents exactly the kind of disciplined, intelligent fighting that the Shinobi Alliance was built to execute. And they're still being pushed back, meter by meter, because the math of the situation doesn't work in their favor no matter how well they fight within it. This is the scene Saitama walks into. Not dramatically, not with any timing that would suggest he understood the significance of the moment. He just comes over a rise in the terrain, sees what's happening below him, and stops to watch for a few seconds with the focused, evaluating expression of someone at a buffet trying to decide which tray to approach first. What he's watching from his vantage point is a large-scale battle involving techniques that produce significant light, sound, and structural damage to the surrounding landscape, which by his standards qualifies as at least visually interesting, even if nothing about the combatants themselves is registering as threatening. He watches a former Kage take a direct hit from a technique that would have vaporized a normal person, regenerate the damage in approximately 4 seconds, and continue moving forward as though nothing happened. He watches Alliance ninja throw everything they have at an opponent who simply will not go down. And somewhere in the analytical part of his brain that still functions even when his emotional investment is low, he registers that the people fighting the regenerating enemies are struggling, and that they appear to be on the same general side as the other people he walked past earlier who pointed weapons at him, and that therefore the regenerating enemies are probably what this situation has instead of a monster. He jumps down, not in a flashy way, not with a battle cry or a declaration of intent. He just steps off the rise and drops to the battlefield floor. And the drop itself is notable only because he falls from a height that should produce a significant impact crater when he lands, and instead just lands quietly, with slightly less disturbance than you'd expect from a person of his size falling that distance, as though whatever force usually governs how hard things hit the ground decided to take the day off. The Alliance ninja closest to him scramble back out of instinct before they register that the impact was smaller than expected. And in that moment of collective recalibration, the half-second where trained fighters are updating their threat assessment, Saitama is already looking at the nearest reanimated Kage with the mild, appraising expression of a person at a car show looking at a model they haven't seen before. The reanimated Kage, to their credit, recognize that something has changed in the situation. Edo Tensei shinobi retain their memories, their personalities, their tactical intelligence. They are not mindless drones. They are fully conscious people who are aware of exactly what has been done to them and who are often deeply unhappy about being forced to fight, but who cannot override the compulsion built into the technique. They have battlefield awareness. They can read the shift in the Alliance soldiers' behavior. They can see this new arrival and run a rapid assessment. Unknown combatant, no visible weapons, no detectable chakra signature, civilian clothing, apparently calm in a situation where calm either means extreme confidence or profound stupidity, and the complete lack of any readable energy signature is something that at least one of the reanimated Kage finds interesting enough to pause and consider rather than immediately attack. Because these are smart people. These are people who spent entire careers reading opponents and situations, and something about this specific arrival pattern doesn't fit any template in their considerable experience. Then one of the reanimated Kage attacks, because whatever this newcomer is, the technique controlling them doesn't allow for extended philosophical hesitation when an unknown factor enters the combat zone, and the attack they launch is not a test. It is a full commitment, high-power offensive technique of the kind that would require a serious response from any shinobi at the Jonin level or above. It's the kind of technique that has been ending alliance ninja all across this sector. The kind that lights up the sky and reshapes terrain. The kind that, when it lands, produces a shockwave that knocks people off their feet 300 meters away. It hits Saitama. He doesn't dodge. Not because he couldn't, there is genuinely no evidence he couldn't have moved, but because based on his body language in the fraction of a second before impact, he either didn't perceive it as something worth dodging or he was curious what it would feel like, and both of those possibilities are, to any observer with enough experience to understand what that technique was, completely insane. The explosion is real. The energy discharge is real. The crater it produces in the ground around the impact point is real and significant. And when the light clears and the dust begins to settle, Saitama is standing in the middle of it looking mildly dusty and slightly more interested than he was 30 seconds ago, patting the side of his face with one hand as though checking whether his cheek feels different, and arriving at the visible conclusion that it does not feel meaningfully different. The silence that follows this moment is the kind of silence that happens when a large group of people simultaneously encounters something that their existing mental framework cannot accommodate without significant restructuring. The Alliance ninja who just watched a full-power technique from a reanimated Kage fail to do anything visible to this person are not panicking, because panic requires a clear threat, and this doesn't feel like a threat. But they are doing something adjacent to panicking, which is the rapid internal experience of every assumption you've built your understanding of the world on becoming unreliable at the same time. Sensor-type ninja are reaching out and finding nothing. Sharing and users are watching and finding no chakra flow, no hand seals, no preparation for any technique they recognize. What they're seeing is a man standing in a crater, mildly curious, in a yellow jumpsuit. Saitama hits the reanimated Kage back. Not with his full power. There is a very strong argument that Saitama has never used his full power on anything in either his own universe or any other. That even his most dramatic feats represent something well short of the actual ceiling of what he can do. But with the kind of casual swat that he'd use on a monster in his own world that seemed about mid-tier, the kind of strike that feels, from his side of it, like flicking something away. The reanimated Kage goes through the landscape. Not into it, not stopped by it, through several hundred meters of rock and earth, and the path their body carves through the terrain is visible from a distance as a trench that simply appears in the battlefield geography, running in a straight line from where Saitama was standing to somewhere considerably further away. The body regenerates, as Edo Tensei bodies do, and comes back, which is the first genuinely interesting thing that has happened from Saitama's perspective. Something got back up. He looks at the regenerating body with the focused attention of a person who has just found something that has a chance of holding his interest for more than a single exchange. And the fact that his expression in this moment contains what might be described as hope is simultaneously the most endearing and most contextually alarming thing visible on this entire battlefield. What unfolds over the next several minutes is not a fight in any conventional sense. It is Saitama repeatedly hitting things that come back, and each time they come back, testing whether hitting them slightly differently produces a result that is more satisfying, while the Alliance ninja around him have collectively made the tactical decision to simply stop fighting the reanimated Kage in this sector and observe, because trying to coordinate with a wildcard of this magnitude, without any information about what they're actually capable of, is more dangerous than stepping back and gathering data. There are sensor-type ninja frantically sending reports to headquarters. There are people on messenger hawks composing messages that keep getting rewritten, because no phrasing of what they're witnessing sounds credible. Somewhere in the chain of command, a very tired strategist is reading a report that describes a bald civilian neutralizing multiple reanimated Kage without visible technique. Apparent damage resistance beyond any known scale, no chakra signature, and is staring at the page trying to decide if this is a genjutsu they're caught in. And through all of this, through every layer of confusion and tactical recalibration and existential crisis rippling outward through the Alliance command structure, the person at the center of it is not experiencing triumph. Saitama is experiencing mild, cautious optimism. The regeneration is new. The scale of the battlefield is new. The variety of techniques being used around him is at minimum visually engaging. Something is nudging at the edge of the feeling he's been chasing for years, the ghost of the excitement that used to come before a fight, and he is trying very hard not to get his hopes up too much because he's been disappointed before. He's been disappointed by things that looked more promising than this. But somewhere in the distance, past the Alliance lines, past the zones of battlefield he's already walked through, the ground is shaking in a way that suggests something considerably larger and more significant is waiting. And for the first time since he arrived in this world, Saitama starts walking with a sense of direction rather than general curiosity. He has heard, somewhere in the chaos of the last hour, a name repeated by the soldiers around him with the particular frequency and weight that words get when they represent maximum fear. He's heard it enough times to have retained it. He doesn't know what it means yet. He doesn't know the history, the mythology, the decades of legend and terror that the name carries. He just knows that everyone around him says it the way people say things that genuinely scare them, and that the ground shakes harder the closer he gets to where they're pointing when they say it. The name is Madara, and Saitama is walking toward it with his hands in his pockets and the quiet, careful hope of a man who has been bored for a very long time. Madara Uchiha's arrival on the main battlefield of the Fourth Great Ninja War is one of those moments in the Naruto series that functions almost like a gravitational event, where everything in the narrative that was moving in its own direction suddenly reorients around a single point, because the weight of what just showed up is too significant to ignore or process in pieces. When Madara descended onto the battlefield where the 4th Division was fighting, he didn't arrive with an army or a plan that required coordination and setup. He arrived alone, with the specific and clearly communicated intention of fighting everyone present simultaneously, not because he was overconfident in the reckless way of villains who underestimate their opponents, but because he had done the math, and the math told him that fighting everyone at once was not meaningfully more difficult than fighting one person at a time. He looked at 10,000 Alliance ninja arrayed against him, and experienced something closer to mild satisfaction at the variety than anything approaching concern about the numbers. And then he demonstrated, methodically and without apparent effort, that his assessment of the situation had been accurate. What Madara did to that division in the opening minutes of his engagement is the kind of sequence that the Naruto series uses to establish a new ceiling for what overwhelming power means in its universe, because it wasn't just the scale of the destruction he produced. It was the manner in which he produced it, the casual, almost bored efficiency of someone performing a task well below their actual capability. He used Susanoo at its most developed form, the complete body Susanoo, a construct so large that it dwarfed the landscape around it, and he used it the way a person might use a broom, sweeping it through formations of ninja with the arm movements of someone clearing debris from a path they want to walk down. He pulled meteors from the sky, not as a desperate final technique, but as an opening statement, as a way of establishing the conversational register of the encounter. And when the first meteor was stopped by a combined effort of multiple high-level ninja pooling their chakra in a massive collaborative technique, his response was to immediately send a second meteor right behind it before anyone had time to recover. Because he understood that the real damage wouldn't come from the impact of either meteor individually, but from the exhaustion and chakra depletion that stopping them would force on the people trying to protect themselves. He was fighting strategically and effortlessly at the same time, which is the most demoralizing combination possible to face, because it means your opponent is thinking 3 moves ahead while operating at a fraction of their actual output. And this is the person that Saitama is walking toward, following the direction that frightened soldiers pointed, and the increasingly dramatic evidence of what's happening at the battlefield's most intense focal point, which is visible from several kilometers away as a region where the sky looks different, where the light has a quality to it that suggests something is fundamentally wrong with the physics in that area, where the ground periodically shudders in a way that travels through the soles of your feet and into your spine with the specific frequency of something enormous happening and not stopping. Saitama has passed through 3 separate battlefield sectors getting here. He has, in passing, neutralized a number of Edo Tensei shinobi without particularly trying to, not because he was hunting them down, but because several of them attacked him while he was walking, and he responded in the same way he responds to everything, which is a single hit that solves the immediate problem and nothing more. Alliance ninja have been following him at a cautious distance for the last kilometer or so, not because they were ordered to escort him, but because watching whatever this is unfold has become something none of them feel capable of looking away from, in the way that you can't look away from a natural phenomenon that you can't yet determine is moving toward you or away from you. Madara senses Saitama before he sees him, or more precisely, Madara notices the absence of something he should be sensing before he identifies the source of that absence, because Madara's Sharingan and Rinnegan together give him a perceptual picture of the battlefield that is about as comprehensive as it's possible to get. He can see chakra flow, track movement, red muscle tension to anticipate attacks before they're launched, and sense the general shape of the life energy around him in a wide radius. What he notices is a gap, a moving gap, a human-shaped absence of chakra moving through his perceptual field in a direction that leads directly toward him. And Madara has enough experience with extraordinary things to understand that a human being with no readable chakra signature, who is walking calmly toward him through an active war zone, is something that warrants attention in a way that the Alliance ninja he's been casually dismantling all afternoon do not. He turns to look, and what he sees is Saitama coming over a ridge at an unhurried walking pace, hands in pockets, looking at the landscape of devastation Madara has produced with the expression of someone at an art gallery, encountering a painting they find technically impressive but emotionally unmoved by. The moment between them before anything physical happens is genuinely interesting to sit with, because both of these people are, in their respective universes, accustomed to a very specific dynamic in their encounters with other fighters, and that dynamic is about to fail for both of them in ways that are mirror images of each other. Madara is accustomed to opponents who are afraid of him, and not in a performative way, in the genuine, visceral, involuntary way where their bodies produce fear responses they can't control because something in them recognizes, at a level below conscious thought, that they are standing near something that could end them without meaningful effort. Even the strongest opponents Madara faces approach him with the weight of his reputation pressing down on them, and that weight changes how they fight, slows their decision-making, introduces hesitation into their movements at exactly the moments when hesitation is most costly. Madara doesn't particularly enjoy this dynamic. He stated as much, that he finds the absence of worthy opponents genuinely disappointing in a way that has its own melancholy to it. But it is the consistent reality of his interactions, and he has learned to work within it. Saitama is not afraid of Madara, not in the suppressed fear-through-discipline way of a trained warrior managing their emotional responses in combat, but genuinely, completely, foundationally unafraid, in the way that you are not afraid of a candle when you are the sun. His body has no fear response to trigger because his body has correctly assessed, at whatever level bodies use to make these assessments, that nothing in the immediate environment represents a threat to its continued existence, and that assessment is accurate. He looks at Madara the way Madara is used to looking at everyone else, with interest, but not urgency, with curiosity, but not concern. And Madara, reading the micro-expressions and body language of an opponent with the most sophisticated visual perception in his world, processes this complete absence of fear and arrives at one of three conclusions. This person is the most disciplined warrior he has ever encountered. This person is suffering from some kind of dissociative break that has removed their capacity for self-preservation instinct. Or this person has a reason not to be afraid that Madara hasn't identified yet. He votes for the third option because it's the only one that's interesting, and Madara, above almost everything else, values being interested. He attacks, not a test. Madara doesn't do tests in the condescending way of villains who want to observe their opponent's reaction before committing. He attacks with the intention of ending the encounter quickly with high-end force, because if this person is genuinely not afraid, the fastest way to gather meaningful information is to hit them with something significant and observe the result. What he launches is a technique powerful enough that any shinobi below the very highest tier would need to commit everything they had to surviving it. A technique that produces real and serious destruction on everything around its intended target, and it crosses the distance between them at a speed that even highly skilled ninja would need the Sharingan to track properly. Saitama doesn't dodge it. He takes it, and in the half-second before he responds, his face does something that it almost never does. It shows a flicker of genuine interest, the specific micro-expression of someone who has just felt something they weren't entirely sure would be possible, like the first drop of rain on a drought-cracked landscape. Not pain, not even the suggestion of pain, but something, some tiny, faint register of contact that is more than the absolute zero he's grown accustomed to. And he hits Madara back. The hit travels through the complete body Susanoo, as though the Susanoo is a suggestion rather than a structure, contacts Madara directly, and sends him through the landscape at a velocity that the Rinnegan can track in the first instant, and then loses because the speed exceeds what even that perceptual system was designed to process. Madara lands at a distance that takes him approximately 4 seconds to cover, even moving at his top speed, regenerates because he's an Edo Tensei reincarnation, and that's what happens, and comes back. And his face, when he returns, is showing an expression that the Alliance ninja observing from the distance of what they've calculated is a safe radius have never seen on any opponent of Madara Uchiha's in any historical account or living memory. He looks engaged, not concerned, not frightened. Engaged, in the way of someone who has been handed something genuinely surprising and finds the experience of surprise pleasurable rather than threatening. What follows is an extended exchange that operates on an entirely different register from everything else happening on this battlefield, because both participants are approaching it from a position of genuine curiosity rather than desperate survival. Madara escalates methodically and with evident enjoyment, moving through his arsenal the way a musician moves through their instrument's range. Not because each technique is the one that will finally solve the problem, but because each technique is worth trying on its own terms, worth seeing what happens, worth the experience of finding out where the edges of this situation actually are. He uses limbo, the invisible shadow clones that operate in a dimension imperceptible to nearly every visual ability, and Saitama, who has no visual ability that tracks chakra dimensions, doesn't dodge the limbo clones, takes every hit from them, and continues as though they're a minor atmospheric condition rather than attacks from a high-dimensional technique that has been confounding Rinnegan users. He activates Perfect Susanoo and drives it into Saitama with the force of a small geological event, and Saitama braces slightly, before the shockwave expands outward in all directions, and Saitama is still standing in the center of it, re-examining the feeling of that impact with the careful attention of a person trying to identify a faint taste. And here is where the tragedy embedded in both of these characters starts to surface and press against each other, because Madara is having, against all expectation, something that feels like what he has always wanted, which is a genuine encounter with an opponent he can't immediately resolve. He doesn't know that Saitama can't be hurt. He doesn't know the ceiling that isn't there. He just knows that for the first time in his long and devastatingly powerful existence, something hit back in a way that produced a sensation he didn't expect, and he is experiencing this as a gift, as the thing he's been denied for decades, and he is leaning into the fight with a kind of alive engagement that his face almost doesn't know how to hold anymore. Meanwhile, Saitama is experiencing the cautious hope of something that is taking more than one punch, something that keeps coming back, something that is escalating in ways he can follow. And he is trying to hold this feeling carefully, trying not to crush it by ending it too soon, trying to ration the escalation, trying to find out how far up this goes before he has to do what he always ends up doing. But there is a difference between them that will eventually resolve this encounter in only one possible way, and both of them know it on some level even before it happens. Madara has a ceiling. It is a ceiling so extraordinarily high that almost nothing in existence has ever come close to it, but it is there, structural, real, a place where his power stops and the next thing begins. He will reach it. He will give everything he has and find the edge of himself, and then he will have nothing left to escalate with. Saitama has never found his ceiling. Saitama has never been given the experience of reaching an edge, of putting out everything he has and finding the wall on the other side of everything. He has been looking for that wall since before he came to this world. He wants to find it more than he has wanted almost anything. And when Madara finally reaches the top of himself and hits Saitama with the absolute maximum of what Madara Uchiha can produce, the combined, stacked, everything at once output of the most powerful reincarnated warrior in the ninja world's history, Saitama feels it. More than anything has made him feel in years. For one genuine, crystalline, real moment, he feels something and he closes his eyes and then he opens them and they are the same eyes they always are. Calm, steady. And just slightly, just barely, just heartbreakingly close to disappointed. He ends it. Not cruelly, not dramatically. He ends it the way he ends everything, with one punch, and Madara's Edo Tensei body comes back. And Saitama looks at it coming back and knows, with the quiet certainty of someone who has been here before in every universe, that it isn't going to be different this time either. There is something more to find here. There has to be. He can feel it in the way the ground is still shaking further ahead, in the way the sky above the distant horizon is wrong in a way that has nothing to do with meteors and everything to do with something that hasn't fully arrived yet. Something is coming that is bigger than this, and Saitama begins walking again. Kaguya Otsutsuki is not a villain in the conventional sense that the Naruto series typically constructs its antagonists, and understanding this distinction is important before we talk about what happens when she encounters Saitama, because the usual dramatic framework for a confrontation between a hero and a villain involves two parties who exist within the same moral and philosophical universe, even when they're on opposite sides of it. One who wants to protect the world and one who wants to reshape or destroy it, both of them operating within the assumption that the world is something that can be engaged with, argued with, fought over. Kaguya doesn't operate within that framework. She predates it. She is the origin point of chakra in the Naruto world, the first person to ever wield it, a being who came to this planet from somewhere else entirely, and who regards the entirety of human civilization, including every technique ever developed, every political structure ever built, every war ever fought, as something that grew in her garden without her permission, and is now being used by people who don't understand what they're touching. Her motivation for casting the infinite Tsukuyomi isn't hatred. It isn't ambition in the human sense. It is something closer to the feeling of a farmer looking at a field that has been growing wild for generations and deciding it is time to harvest. The people in the field are not her enemies. They are her crop. This is the being that the entire second half of the Fourth Great Ninja War is building toward. The revelation behind the revelation. The thing behind Tobai, behind the Akatsuki, behind every layer of the conflict that the Alliance has been peeling back. And when she finally emerges, when the 10 tails is suppressed enough and the conditions are right, and she tears through from wherever she was waiting with the specific unhurried certainty of something that has been patient for a very long time because it has never had a reason to feel urgency. The effect on everyone present is immediate and total. Naruto, whose ability to read people and chakra through his own sensitivity, has become extraordinarily refined by this point in the war, describes her presence as something that makes the air feel different, as though the atmosphere itself is reconfiguring around a new gravitational center. Sasuke, whose Sharingan has been evolving across the entire arc of the series toward something capable of perceiving and engaging with god-level threats, looks at Kaguya, and for a moment his eyes, which have seen things that would break most people, go wide with something that isn't quite fear, but is the next room over from it. Recognition, maybe, of a scale of power that his abilities can perceive clearly enough to understand, and that understanding is its own kind of overwhelming. Kaguya's combat capabilities operate on principles that are fundamentally different from those of every other fighter in the Naruto world, and this isn't just a matter of degree. It isn't that she does what other ninja do, but more powerfully, the way that Madara does what other Uchiha do, but further. She manipulates dimensions as a combat technique, opening portals to different environments mid-battle, and using the transition between them as a weapon, sending opponents into spaces where the laws of physics are configured to disadvantage them, where gravity shifts or the temperature is lethal or the landscape itself is a threat. She can absorb chakra techniques by touching them, meaning that every ninjutsu, every chakra-based offense, feeds her rather than damages her. She can divide herself across multiple bodies, requiring opponents to track and engage multiple simultaneous threats that share her intelligence and tactical awareness. Her Byakugan and Rin Sharingan give her a perceptual picture of reality that is comprehensive in every direction simultaneously, making the concept of a blind spot essentially inapplicable to her. She produces techniques that are not drawn from any established jutsu tradition because she is the tradition, she is the source, the original text, and everything else is a translation. Against all of this, Naruto and Sasuke are the designated response. Their power at this point is real and significant. Naruto has 6 paths chakra from Hagoromo Otsutsuki, which gives him abilities that transcend the normal ninja power system, and Sasuke has been given a corresponding enhancement that brings his Sharingan to a level capable of perceiving Kaguya's dimensional techniques clearly enough to work with. Together they can actually contend with her, can keep her engaged, can survive the encounter long enough to execute the sealing technique that is the only viable solution to the problem she represents. The fight is not them winning. It is them surviving and maneuvering long enough to apply a technique that doesn't defeat her so much as remove her from the equation. This distinction matters enormously. The endgame against Kaguya is not conquest. It is containment. Nobody in the Naruto world is capable of defeating Kaguya in a straight fight because Kaguya is not calibrated for a straight fight. She is calibrated for a reality where she is the ceiling, where the concept of something being strong enough to simply overpower her does not exist, because in the history of the Naruto world as it actually unfolded, that concept had never needed to exist. Saitama arrives at this confrontation in the way he arrives at everything, which is to say without fanfare and with imperfect timing. The dimensional distortion that Kaguya's presence creates on the battlefield is visible and physically weird in ways that Saitama finds genuinely interesting as environmental phenomena. The air shimmering at the edges of portals she's opened and left slightly ajar, the texture of gravity being subtly wrong in the immediate vicinity, the way sound behaves differently within 30 meters of her, as though it too is uncertain about the local rules. He has been following the ground shaking and the sky wrongness for the last several minutes, and it has led him here, to the outermost edge of the space where Naruto and Sasuke are in the middle of the most desperate and consequential fight of their lives. A fight where every decision has weight, and every mistake has immediate and potentially catastrophic consequences. And Saitama walks into the periphery of it, and stops to watch with the patient attention of someone who has arrived at what they came for, and is taking a moment to assess before engaging. What he sees is Kaguya, and the thing about seeing Kaguya that is different from seeing Madara, or seeing the reanimated Kage, or seeing any of the other significant power sources he's encountered since arriving in this world is that Kaguya reads differently. Not in terms of chakra, because Saitama doesn't read chakra. Not in terms of any technical assessment of her techniques, because Saitama doesn't have a framework for evaluating ninjutsu. It's something more instinctive than that, something in the same register as the quality of light in a room or the temperature of an environment. There is something about the space around Kaguya that his body, which has been categorically unbothered by everything it has encountered for years, registers as worth paying attention to. Not as a threat, just as a presence of sufficient scale that even his thoroughly desensitized sense of what is significant in a given environment notices it. He watches her redirect one of Naruto's techniques by touching it and absorbing it, watches the dimensional portal she opens and the way Naruto and Sasuke have to coordinate rapidly to avoid being separated into different dimensions, watches the absolute economy of her movements. She doesn't rush, doesn't strain, doesn't have the body language of someone in a fight so much as someone performing a necessary task, and something in him recognizes that economy, because it is exactly how he moves. And the recognition creates a specific feeling that is the closest thing to solidarity that Saitama's emotional landscape has produced in a long time. Then Kaguya notices him. This is where things become interesting in a way that goes beyond the physical. Kaguya's perception of reality is comprehensive enough that she has been aware of Saitama's presence in this world since before he arrived at this specific location. Her Byakugan and Rin Sharingan give her a picture of the battlefield so complete that unknown factors register immediately. And Saitama has been an unknown factor since the moment he appeared in this world. A gap in the chakra landscape that her vision has been sliding over for the last several hours without being able to resolve into a readable form. She knows where he is. She has known where he was at every point since his arrival. What she hasn't done is assess him as relevant, because the gaps in her chakra perception, the things she can't read, have always previously resolved into either very disciplined shinobi who suppress their signatures tightly or anomalous animals or terrain features. And none of those categories produce the kind of threat that requires her attention, while she is managing a two-front engagement with opponents who are, she will acknowledge, more capable than she expected. But there is a message that has been working its way through the battlefield for the last several hours, traveling by word of mouth through terrified soldiers and baffled commanders and increasingly confused strategists. A message that keeps getting passed upward through every chain of command, until it arrives at people who can perceive the battlefield most comprehensively. And the core of this message is consistent across every source. Something is here that hit Madara Uchiha and Madara came back, and something hit him again and he came back, and this continued for an extended period, and something appears to be functionally undamaged by everything Madara produced. Kaguya hears this message in the way she hears everything, not through a communication channel but through her own perception, reading the fear patterns and behavioral shifts of the thousands of shinobi on the field, processing the ripple of information moving through them like a signal through water, and arriving at a conclusion that she doesn't often arrive at, which is that she needs to update her model of this situation before continuing. She turns to look at Saitama directly, not with her peripheral perception, but with the full, focused attention of every visual ability she possesses simultaneously trained on a single point, and what she finds is nothing readable. A human body with human biology, no chakra network, no flowing energy of any kind that her most sophisticated sensory apparatus can identify, no dimensional irregularity explaining his presence, no seal or technique or artifact accounting for his capabilities. He is, to her perception, a man in a yellow suit who is standing in the middle of a dimensional war zone looking at her with the expression of someone who has just found the thing they came for. And Kaguya, who has seen civilizations rise and fall, who has observed human beings for so long that she has categorized and filed away every variation of what a human being can be, experiences something she has not experienced in a very long time, which is the specific intellectual discomfort of an encounter that doesn't fit any existing category. She attacks him, not as a test in the cautious sense, but as a resolution. She applies a technique of absolute scale, one that doesn't target him specifically so much as reconfigure the local reality in a way that should be incompatible with the continued physical existence of any matter not specifically protected by her own energy. It is the kind of technique that operates at a level below individual combat and above it at the same time, the kind that changes the rules of the space rather than engaging within them. And Saitama stands in the middle of it, and the space reconfigures around him, and he is still there when the reconfiguration completes, looking at her with the same expression he had before except slightly more focused, like someone who has heard a sound they recognize and is trying to remember where from. He punches in her direction. Not at her, she opens a portal reflexively, the defensive instinct of a being who has been navigating dimensional space as a combat environment for so long that portal opening is as automatic as breathing, and the punch goes through the portal and arrives somewhere that is not where Saitama is standing, which would normally end the exchange in her favor because redirecting an attack through a portal is exactly the kind of technique that makes her effectively untouchable. But the portal doesn't close cleanly. The energy of the redirected strike interacts with the portal's dimensional membrane in a way that produces a structural irregularity, a hairline crack in the dimensional fabric that Kaguya's Rin Sharingan can see and that she understands, with a deep and unhurried certainty, is not supposed to be possible. A physical strike is not supposed to be able to stress dimensional space. The dimensional space she manipulates is not a physical medium. It is something operating at a level that physical force, even extraordinary physical force, does not have a purchase on. The fact that it cracked means the force behind that punch is operating at a scale that transcends the physical-metaphysical distinction that she has always treated as absolute. She reassesses, and in the moment of reassessment, something passes across her face that is neither fear nor concern but something more primary than both, something that, if you watched her expression very carefully across the entire history of her appearances in the Naruto series, you would recognize as completely unprecedented. She is uncertain, not about strategy or timing or technique selection, uncertain about the nature of the situation, uncertain about what category of thing she is dealing with. And for a being who has existed long enough that uncertainty stopped being a regular feature of her experience sometime before most human civilizations developed writing, that uncertainty is the closest thing to alarm that her emotional architecture can produce. She has made her last mistake by standing still long enough to let him close the distance, and when Saitama reaches her and hits her, not with his full power, never with his full power, but with significantly more than he used on Madara because something in his body has finally recalibrated toward what this situation seems to require. The dimensional space around them shatters outward like glass. Every portal she had opened simultaneously destabilizing as the structural integrity of her local dimensional manipulation collapses under the shockwave. And Kaguya goes through dimensions she was controlling involuntarily, bouncing through realities she designed as weapons, experiencing her own battlefield turned against her by the simple and annihilating fact of a force she never built her world to account for. She regenerates. She returns. She is Kaguya, and she cannot be defeated in the conventional sense any more than Madara could. The solution to her is still the sealing, still requires Naruto and Sasuke, still requires the specific technique that the Sage of Six Paths entrusted to them. But something has changed in the dynamic of this encounter in a way that changes everything around it. Because Naruto and Sasuke, watching from the sides of this exchange, with the complex and multi-layered emotional response of people who have been fighting desperately for their lives, and are now watching something else engage their opponent with a casualness that makes their desperation feel strangely distant, are no longer the most pressing thing in Kaguya's awareness. And a Kaguya whose attention is divided, whose certainty has been cracked, whose dimensional workspace has been structurally compromised by a shockwave she did not build contingencies for, is a Kaguya that two very gifted shinobi with the right technique can position around, can maneuver, can find the angle on that the whole fight has been building toward. The sealing doesn't become unnecessary. Saitama is not the solution to Kaguya in the neat, clean sense of one thing canceling another out. But he is the disruption, the unprecedented variable, the thing her defenses were never designed to encounter, and in the space his disruption creates, the people who were always meant to finish this story find the room they needed. After Kaguya is sealed, after the dimensional space stabilizes and the portals close, and the sky returns to something that looks like a sky again rather than a wound in reality, there is a period of silence across the battlefield that has a specific quality to it, the quality of silence that follows something enormous rather than the silence that precedes it. And in that silence, the full weight of what just happened begins to settle onto everyone who was present for it. The Alliance ninja who survived are doing the things that people do after surviving something they weren't sure they would survive, checking themselves and each other for damage, sitting down on whatever surface is available because their legs have decided that standing is no longer mandatory. Looking at each other with the specific expression of people trying to confirm through eye contact that the experience they just had was shared and real, and not some elaborate psychological event produced by stress and chakra exhaustion. The Edo Tensei reincarnations, freed now that the conflict driving their deployment has resolved, are beginning to feel the release of the technique pulling them back toward wherever they came from, back toward the rest they were denied when Kabuto dragged them out of it. And there is in the expressions of those who retain enough agency to have expressions something that looks remarkably like relief. The 10 tails is suppressed. Kaguya is sealed. The immediate existential threat to every human consciousness on the planet has been, through a combination of extraordinary effort from people who gave everything they had, and the completely unplanned intervention of a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit, averted. Saitama is sitting on a piece of rubble at the edge of what used to be the main engagement zone, and he is doing something that, if you have spent any time at all watching him in his own series, you recognize immediately as the most reliable indicator of his emotional state. He is doing nothing, not resting in the purposeful way of a fighter recovering between rounds, not thinking with the focused inward attention of someone processing a significant experience. Just sitting, with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, in the specific way of someone who has arrived at the end of something and is now in the process of finding out what the end feels like, and the finding out is not going as well as he had hoped. The war is over, or close enough to over that the remaining details feel like administrative tasks rather than stakes, and the feeling he was chasing when he walked onto this battlefield, the feeling that brought him all the way from his own universe through whatever dimensional accident deposited him here, that feeling came, briefly and partially, and then resolved back into the familiar background hum of not quite enough. Naruto finds him first. Because of course, Naruto finds him first. Because the thing that Naruto does better than almost anyone in his world is move toward people who are sitting alone at the edges of things rather than in the middle of the celebration. And he does this not as a calculated social strategy, but because something in him is genuinely pulled in that direction by the instinct of someone who spent years being the person sitting alone at the edge, and who therefore recognizes the shape of it immediately. He approaches without the wariness that every other Alliance ninja is maintaining at a careful distance. They know what they watched Saitama do, have spent the last several hours updating their understanding of what is possible in the universe to accommodate what they observed. And that updating process has produced in most of them a kind of awed caution that keeps them several meters further away from Saitama than they'd stand from any other person. Naruto sits down next to him without asking permission and without the caution, and for a moment neither of them says anything, which is fine because the silence between them doesn't have the uncomfortable texture that silence usually has between strangers who don't have a shared language. Naruto asks him, in the way Naruto asks things directly and without diplomatic softening, whether he found what he was looking for. And Saitama, who doesn't have enough of the local language to communicate with full precision, but has picked up enough over the hours of being surrounded by it that the rough outline of the question lands, thinks about it for a long moment before answering, and his answer is the honest one, which is something like almost. Almost is a significant word from Saitama. Almost is more than he usually gets to say. Madara gave him almost. Kaguya gave him closer to almost than Madara did. The regenerating bodies were new. The dimensional disruption was new. The sheer scale and variety of the battlefield was new in a way that kept him present and engaged for longer than most things manage. He was, for several genuine stretches of this experience, actually inside something that felt like it was happening rather than watching something happen from behind glass. That's not nothing. For Saitama, that is specifically and meaningfully not nothing. And the fact that he can say almost rather than the usual deflected non-answer he gives when people ask him about fights suggests that this world, for all its inability to actually threaten him, produced more of what he was chasing than most. Naruto processes this, and then does the thing that is most characteristic of him, which is to respond to an emotional admission from someone he has known for approximately one afternoon, with the same depth of engagement he would give to someone he has known his entire life. Because, for Naruto, the length of acquaintance is almost irrelevant to the depth of investment, and what he hears in Saitama's answer is something he recognizes in his bones. He recognizes the shape of someone who wants desperately to feel something they used to feel and can no longer access in the same way, because Naruto has spent his entire life running toward connection and meaning, and the feeling of mattering to something larger than himself, and the idea that you could achieve everything and still find the achievement hollow, because the process of achieving consumed the part of you that could enjoy it. That idea lands on him with specific weight. He doesn't have a solution. He doesn't pretend to have a solution, which is important because Naruto's most powerful relational instinct isn't to fix people's problems, but to sit with them in the problems in a way that makes the problems feel shared rather than isolating. He just nods slowly, in the way of someone who understood more than they were given enough words to confirm, and then he looks out at the battlefield and is quiet with Saitama for a while. Sasuke, who has been watching this interaction from a distance with the outward expression of someone who finds it either irrelevant or vaguely irritating, and the inward experience of someone processing it more carefully than they want to admit, eventually walks over with the specific gait of a person who decided to approach something, and then became less certain about the decision with each step but committed anyway. He doesn't sit. He stands slightly apart from them and looks at Saitama with his Sharingan still active, still trying to read something, still finding the same absence he's been finding every time he's tried to assess this person throughout the day's events. The Sharingan is many things, but above everything else it is a tool for seeing clearly, for perceiving what is really there underneath what is presented, for cutting through surface to substance, and what it keeps returning to when it focuses on Saitama is the same answer every time. What is presented is what is there. There is no hidden depth of technique or strategy or suppressed power waiting beneath the surface. This is simply a person, and the person is simply this strong. And there is no more complicated explanation available. Sasuke, whose entire understanding of strength is built on the premise that power is always a product of something, of sacrifice, of heritage, of will, of pain, of the specific accumulation of choices that carve a person into what they become, finds this conclusion philosophically difficult to sit with and cannot make himself leave it alone. He asks, and the question he asks is not the tactical one you might expect from him, but something more personal, something that sounds like it belongs to an older and more uncertain version of himself, but that he asks anyway because the day has been too large for the usual armor to hold completely. He asks whether Saitama ever gets tired of it, of winning before it starts, of fighting without the possibility of the outcome going the other way. And Saitama looks at him, and the answer he gives is one of the most honest things he has said to anyone in longer than he can measure, which is that tired is the wrong word for it. Tired suggests a specific feeling, an identifiable sensation with a name and a character. What he has is more like the absence of the opposite, the absence of the feeling of not being tired, the absence of the tension and the stakes, and the possibility space that makes a fight feel like a fight rather than a foregone conclusion performed in real time. It's not exhaustion. It's the lack of anything to be exhausted by. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a heavy door and a door that opens before you can push it. Sasuke is quiet for a long time after that, and then he says something that he would probably never say under normal circumstances, something that his pride and his independence and his carefully maintained posture of self-sufficiency would usually intercept before it reached his mouth, which is that what Saitama is describing sounds like loneliness. And Saitama considers this, and doesn't dismiss it, and doesn't confirm it either, just sits with it the way you sit with an assessment that is close enough to accurate that arguing with it feels dishonest but not quite accurate enough to accept without reservation. And the three of them, the Jinchuriki who wanted to be recognized, the Avenger who wanted to prove something to the world and to himself, and the hero who wanted to find something worth the effort of being a hero, are briefly and improbably in the same emotional room together, which is a room that none of them would have expected to be in, and that each of them needed in ways they couldn't have articulated before they were in it. The practical aftermath of the war, in a version of events where Saitama participated, produces problems of a kind that the Alliance's strategists and village leaders are genuinely not equipped to handle, because the political and historical architecture of the ninja world is built on a very specific understanding of what power looks like, and where it comes from, and who is allowed to have it. And Saitama's existence in the world for even a single day has produced evidence that breaks every assumption that architecture was built on. The hidden villages maintain their hierarchies and their political relationships with each other partly, because everyone has a rough understanding of where everyone else sits on the power scale, and that understanding creates the stable tensions and alliances and deterrents that keep the world from collapsing into constant total war. Insert a person whose power scale has no readable position into that system, and the system doesn't know how to process it. Is he an asset to the Leaf Village because he happened to fight on their side? Is he a threat to every village because he is, by any measurable standard, more powerful than every village's collective military capacity combined? Is he a person with political rights and obligations in this world? And if so, to whom? The Hokage, whichever version of that conversation happens, whether it's Tsunade in the moment or the subsequent leadership, will eventually have to sit across from this man in a yellow jumpsuit and figure out what the correct diplomatic posture towards something unprecedented actually looks like. There is no historical precedent. The ninja world has never needed one. The reanimated shinobi who were freed, particularly the ones with enough agency and awareness to have processed what they observed during their time on the battlefield, carry something back with them toward whatever release awaits them that is more complex than the simple relief of ending. Itachi, who watched from wherever his Edo Tensei body was deployed during the period when Saitama was moving through the battlefield, would have registered something. And Itachi registering something means it gets filed in that extraordinary mind with precision and care. Hashirama, whose own power is the benchmark the ninja world uses for impossibly strong, would have encountered Saitama and felt the specific experience of having your own benchmark become inadequate, not threatened, just quietly superseded, in the way that any record eventually gets broken if you wait long enough. Madara, despite everything, would have been not humbled, because Madara doesn't do humbled, but genuinely richer in experience for having fought something that required him to reach all the way to the top of himself and find the top insufficient. In a life defined by disappointment with opponents, the last fight he had in reanimated form was the first one that demanded everything and still wasn't enough. And there is in that experience something that even Madara, who would never say it aloud, might privately file under worth having. And Saitama himself, when the dimensional accident or technique or whatever brought him here, eventually deposits him back in his own world, back in the apartment with the leaky faucet and the sparse refrigerator and the hero ranking that still doesn't reflect what he actually is. What does he carry back from this? He carries almost. He carries the specific memory of a day that lasted longer than most fights do, that produced more varied inputs than most fights do, that contained at least 2 moments where something registered with enough force to feel like something. He carries the image of Naruto Uzumaki sitting next to him without asking why, and the strange accuracy of Sasuke calling it loneliness, and the way that even in a world where he couldn't be threatened, the sheer scale of what was at stake for everyone else made the stakes feel real by proximity. The way that standing next to someone who is genuinely afraid makes the thing they're afraid of feel briefly and partially present even when it can't touch you. He carries the knowledge that there are worlds where the power ceiling is higher than what he's found in his own, and that higher ceilings mean longer searches, and longer searches mean more time inside the feeling of searching, which is the closest he can get to the feeling he originally trained for. The question the video's title asks, what if Saitama entered the Naruto War, has a tactical answer, which is that the war ends faster and with fewer casualties, because several of its most durable problems get solved by a variable nobody was accounting for. But the more interesting answer, the one worth sitting with after the tactical rundown is done, is what the encounter means for both worlds. The Naruto world is built on the belief that suffering is the currency of strength, that the price of power is always paid in something real, that the distance between who you are and who you need to be is crossed only through genuine cost. Saitama paid that cost and came out the other side and found that the crossing was the point, not the destination, that the destination without the crossing is just an empty room. And the Naruto world's characters, who are in many ways defined by their crossings, by the specific roads they traveled and what those roads cost them, are the right audience for that specific tragedy, because they understand the value of the journey in a way that only people who have suffered their journey can. They look at Saitama and see, not power, but the warning embedded in power fully achieved, the reminder that the struggle is not the obstacle to the feeling of being alive. The struggle is the feeling. And a man who can no longer struggle is a man who won everything and lost the one thing that winning was supposed to be for. That is what the fourth great ninja war would have meant to a man who can't feel it. Not a battle, not a victory, a reminder, almost but not quite the thing he's been looking for. One more world searched, one more ceiling found and surpassed, and somewhere out there in some dimension he hasn't walked through yet, the possibility, faint, persistent, stubbornly alive despite every disappointment, that the next one might be different. That the next one might be the one that finally makes him feel it again. He puts his hands in his pockets and he keeps walking, because that is what Saitama does, and it is the most human thing about him, and maybe the most human thing there is.